Okay, welcome everyone to our second session, or second panel, I should say. Skills and knowledge in tension, what should the curriculum teach? So my name's Tony Gilland. I'm Chief of Staff at MCC Brussels. Delighted to be here with you. Prior to joining MCC Brussels just under a year ago, I was a maths teacher in the UK for 10 years. And I taught in grammar schools, teaching students who aspired to the very best universities in the country. But I also taught in post-16 vocational education, teaching students who had failed to secure a qualifying grade in mathematics. So I've got a very strong interest in this session and what's going on. And I guess essentially the question we are dealing with here is, what should school education teach? Okay, that's really what we're talking about. Now, many of you will know, but not everyone, that here we are, obviously, in Brussels, and many people from the European Union have joined us in terms of, we have people from the Parliament and the Commission, which is brilliant. The reality is that education is not a European Union competence. It is, rightly, a competence for national governments and for nations. It's not a European competence. However, it won't surprise you to know that the European Union is paying an increasing and growing interest in education, particularly teacher training, which we know is a key point of politicization of education. And just 5 years ago, the European Union established the European Education Area, which it did to work together with member states to build more resilient and inclusive education. On its website, it says, what is the EU doing in school education? And its answer is as follows. The European Commission works with EU member states to support and reinforce the development of key competencies and basic skills for all. And on the page where it talks about why this is so important, the word knowledge is mentioned not once. Knowledge is mentioned not once. But across Europe, I think if you listen to what many education ministers and politicians say about education, you will hear the phrase key skills rather more than you'll hear the word knowledge. I think it's not just an issue within the European Union. So, in fact, if you were to do a word count of the number of times you hear the word skills versus the number of times you hear the word knowledge, you might think that knowledge is now an outdated concept. So, how did we get here, and how can we rescue a knowledge-based education? That's the question we have before us, and we have a wonderful panel to do so. So, in the order in which they'll speak, first of all, on my far left, we have here Anthony O'Hare. And I take great fun in describing Anthony O'Hare as on my far left. But anyway, sorry, that was a silly joke.
When I played football, I was a left winger.
Excellent.
I couldn't kick with my right foot.
Wonderful, right. So Anthony is a professor of philosophy at the University of Buckingham, and he's also a former advisor to the British government on teacher training and the curriculum. Okay? And then next will be Alka Sigal Cuthbert, who's on my immediate right. She's the author of What Should Schools Teach, along with Alex Standish, who's also in the audience, and a director of an excellent grassroots campaign, Don't Divide Us, which is fighting the influence of critical race theory, or trying to, but nonetheless, a very, very wonderful campaign. Then we have Richard Fodor. Delighted Richard is on the panel because he is the research group coordinator for MCC Learning Institute, who have jointly programmed 2 days with us, and this is very much a partnership, and we've heard from your director on the first panel. Also, Richard, prior to joining MCC Learning Institute, was a teacher of history and English language, so brings that experience to the panel. Finally, very pleased to have Ruth Mishbuller, who's a senior lecturer in education at the University of Derby. Okay, they've got about 7 minutes. If you could aim for an after, too much after that, I'll ask you to wind up. Okay. Anthony, please.
Okay. Right. Well, it seems to me that educational disputes and differences in education are fundamentally anthropological questions, philosophical questions, if you like. And I think that just what I want to do very quickly is just point to what I think are some important trends in current thinking, if one may call it that, about education, and to show you how they come from philosophical differences about the nature of humanity. So the position that I would defend in education, you can call it liberal education or sometimes classical education. It starts from the position that children are immature, and actually this is quite a strong theme in Hannah Arendt, and that what you need to do in education is to move the child from its biological natural immaturity into a state of being accultured, acquiring the culture that has developed within the society or where the child lives over generations. And this is what John McDowell, the philosopher, calls second nature, if you like. So on top of our biological nature, we have to impose a second nature. And we can't invent it for ourselves, that is the child or any of us. It's something we inherit. And this isn't entirely a matter of thinking or academic knowledge. I follow the ancient Greeks, Aristotle and Plato, in this respect, that I think fundamental to education is what the Greeks called music and gymnastic. Because I think that before the child can really think or reason, it has to be inducted into habits of virtue and sensibility. And music for the Greeks meant things to do with the muses, that is obviously music, but also poetry, history, narrative, and so on. And I think that this training in sensibility is absolutely crucial to what I understand by classical education. And when you move to the more academic side of it, you don't forget the musical side of it in the Greek sense of music. Gymnastic, yes, because we're human beings, we must learn to speak, walk, and generally be bodily competent and dignified. Of course, the Greeks wanted gymnastic because the men were expected to fight, but we can leave that aside. I still think that gymnastic would be a very important part of any classical education, liberal education I wanted my children to go to, as indeed it was. But when we come to the more academic side of it, what we are looking for in liberal education is what Matthew Arnold spoke of as the best that has been thought and known, leading, in the words of Cardinal Newman, who actually thought quite profoundly about education, to a true enlargement of mind that comes through being steeped in the culture which, if you're lucky, you inherit. Of course, it's a culture you have to inherit because you won't pick it up naturally. And that's why you need, from the classical education point of view, that's why you need formal education. Of course, there are disputes about what the best that's thought and known is, but I think that, well, I'm going to come on to some opposition in a second, but I think if you step back a bit, it would be very difficult to argue that, say, Homer, Virgil, Dante, Milton, Racine, Goethe weren't the best that's thought and known. Of course, all the very things that children are not nowadays being taught. Now, the opposition to this idea of education, really, I want to put it into two categories, really. We have to go back to the 17th century and the rise of science and technology. And Francis Bacon was an a very influential thinker on science, and he thought that science should dispense with all presuppositions from the past, and including classical learning, although of course he was extremely well educated classically himself. He thought that education should simply be about what helped human beings to improve what he called man's estate. And he was followed in this by John Locke, who wrote about, the philosopher Locke, who wrote about education in 1693, I think, also advocating that education should be simply about what was technologically important and helpful. This, of course, is where a lot of the stress on skills comes from nowadays, and much of the opposition to classical education comes from what you might think of as, in general terms, from the political left. But of course, this economic side of education, this skills-based, in the tradition of Bacon and Locke, that of course is taken up by many people who wouldn't think of themselves as at all left-wing, but people who want to stress the importance of the economy and so on and so forth. The liberal education wouldn't deny that those things are important, but they would think that the most important thing about education is to learn things which are good for themselves, and good that just if you knew them and thought about them, and by the way, not necessarily were examined in them. However, the economic utilitarian argument against, or position against, liberal education isn't the only one by any means. We also have to think about the romantic ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, broadly speaking, thought that children were good in themselves and didn't necessarily need to be trained in habits of virtue, as the classical liberal thinkers and the ancient Greeks thought, and that children should understand and learn through play and, as it were, spontaneous interaction with nature. Added to Rousseau, of course, I don't need to emphasize the influence that Rousseau and people following in his tradition, such as Froebel, Pestalozzi, Madame Montessori, had. You know, you can't go into a primary school nowadays without seeing it full of Rousseauan ideas in practice. Though, of course, Rousseau never taught anybody and thought that the pupil should be taught completely on his own, but never mind. The romantic spirit of Rousseau has flooded primary education. On top of that, we have to add what I think is the politicization of education that you find in John Dewey. John Dewey, like Locke and Bacon, wanted education to be addressed to current instrumental problems. But he gave this a political dimension, and he wanted the classroom itself to be a kind of miniature democratic forum in which, as he put it, this is a quotation from him, the teacher would be the facilitator of group activities, not a teacher. And Dewey was scornful, as indeed was Rousseau, of the heritage of the past. He thought that most of the knowledge that was being taught in schools from the classics and so on, he thought this was outdated, outworn, of no use, and simply produced social divisions and should be done away with in the schools that he set up. He actually, unlike Rousseau, did set up 2 schools in Chicago in the 1890s. We can talk about them, the number of teachers they had, and so on and so forth. But he wanted children to learn through discovery, not through being taught. And we can, on top of Rousseau and Dewey, this combination, which I think you can see in most colleges and departments of education still to this day, we should add the influence of Marx, Nietzsche, and Francophone thinkers such as Michel Foucault, whose basic view was that what was underlying everything was power and power structures. And this is where you get the kind of mentality in education these days that says what we have to teach about is the political structures, the unjust political structures that exist, unjust sexual ideology, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into the details of these because I'm sure you're too well aware of them yourselves. But again, these power ideas, and of course power is important, but Marx was wrong, Nietzsche was wrong, Foucault is disgraceful, but they're wrong because power is important, but it's not the only thing that's important. Many other things are important. But once you get the obsession with power, then you interpret everything in those ways. You interpret Shakespeare or Homer as a representative of power structures and completely distort what's in them, which is what the liberal educator wants. And I'm just going to end by saying that I think one of the problems that we face these days is when education gets in the hands of state agencies, which is picking up what Tony said earlier, you're likely to get the economic and political dimensions of education emphasized, and the idea that education could be a good in itself and isn't good for anything else other than for children to be educated and to inherit their culture, that gets pushed out, and when government agencies start taking over, you get an emphasis in education away from the liberal classical ideal to an education that combines, in a kind of rather curious way, economic with political ideology.
Thank you. And Auke, please.
I'd like to start by thanking MCC for inviting me to this conference about something so important and the second love of my life after my husband and family, I suppose. Thank you, Jacob, for a wonderful introduction that I think set out the really salient points of Hannah Arendt's thinking on education. And I'd really like to come back to that in a minute and just sort of develop some of the things that you mentioned this morning. I would say, first of all, I'm just very quickly slightly wary of the second nature argument, because for me, I'm a Platonist in a sense, or an idealist. I think human beings are a sui generis species unto ourselves, and a baby, even before it can say any word, as it's waving its arms around and looking googly-eyed everywhere, isn't just acting in an animalistic way, it's acting in a very human way. It's exploring its environment in the only way it has accessible to it, which is through its perceptions and sensory apparatus. And that actually then is going to link into the question of knowledge later on, because it links in with how conceptual and logical knowledge sits with aesthetic knowledge, and where perception and intellect come in. So I just wanted to just sort of flag that up quickly. I was asked by Tony, where do skills fit into your conception of what a good education looks like? And I just want to say, skills don't fit in at all. I think it's actually a misnomer to use the word skills as a discrete common noun. I think it's really more of an adverb, skillfully. And we use it to express a value judgment on how well a particular act is undertaken, whether that's reading, cooking an omelette, playing with a baby, or addressing a political conference or whatever. In art, what does it mean to say she has a skill in drawing, other than to say she draws skillfully? She's showing aesthetic judgment in her execution of producing lines by charcoal or by pencil or pastels, in the execution of producing lines that create a pleasing image. So I think today we have to understand, when we're talking in educational discourse, when we are talking about, like most things in educational discourse, it's incredibly fetishized. Skills today in education means anything that is on the curriculum that is intentionally anti-intellectual, that is intentionally anti-aesthetic, and that intentionally addresses the pupils, our younger generation, as if they could fall into different categorical types. Some people academically inclined, some people skills inclined. This is not true. This is a fundamental lie if you believe in the fundamental moral autonomy and equality of human beings as a species. Now, okay, all well and good there, but Alka, and I totally forgot to say I have actually been a teacher for 20 years and a lecturer as well. What do you do when you're in a classroom and you have, like, I've got, Jessica over here who can read Shakespeare independently, and I've got Anthony at the back. So no, sorry, not you, Joanne. No, I'm using all the wrong names here. Philippa at the back, who can struggle, can't sort of really get beyond simple sentences. What do? Surely we're not all equal. Well, yes, morally they are all equal. Okay? Culturally, in terms of cultural capital, if you like, intellectually, cognitively, they're not at the same level. And that could be for all sorts of reasons, but that doesn't negate their fundamental equality. As an educator, what does that mean? We are encouraged today, for all the reasons that we've rehearsed very well, are encouraged to say, well, Jessica, you teach Shakespeare. Philippa at the back, well, let's find something a little less difficult for her. Let's find something a little more relevant to what Jessica likes anyway. Let's deny Jessica one of the most precious jewels of our civilization, a jewel that has inspired people across the world of all colours and nations. No, we need to stand up as educators and refuse to do that when we're asked. And we can do it. Because if we are secure in our knowledge of literature, we can then say, well, right, in order to get Philippa to a level where she can begin to make Shakespeare meaningful for her, we don't need different knowledge. What we need more freedom. We need more freedom to experiment, to try out different ways of making Shakespeare meaningful for someone who has yet to reach the same level of abstract thinking as Jessica has at the front. And I want to just give you an example here. I'm hoping I have people in the audience here who are going to be teachers or who are possibly training to be teachers. So I was struggling with the problem of how to teach collective nouns, okay? One group got it immediately. They understood collective noun. Flock of sheep, herd of cows, easy peasy, not a problem. Another group was really struggling. They could not really understand the conceptual difference between a singular noun and a plural noun. A flock of sheep, a herd of cows. How can something be singular and plural at the same time? Conceptually, it was very difficult for them. I looked to my teacher, the stuff that is around in teacher educational discourse to help me. Different styles of learning, they said. Try visual. Maybe they're visual learners, So we tried drawing pictures. I tried bringing in pictures. I tried doing abstract dots, singular and plural. And eventually I realized all I was doing was just confusing them with more concept-based explanations when the problem in the first place was that they couldn't think at that level of conceptual abstraction. So what could I do? I was tearing my hair out. And then I remembered the answer was not skills. The answer was actually to go back to my notes for my PhD and reread what I'd read on Kantian aesthetics and more recent literature on aesthetics and some stuff on child development and how children learn language. And it clicked. When we acquire knowledge, we move from the more simpler the perceptual forms into more abstract forms. So I had to make an abstract concept concrete for them in some way. So I couldn't bring in a herd of cows and I couldn't bring in a flock of seagulls. So I took in a bunch of grapes and I showed them, what have we got here? A bunch of grapes. They understood that. I then showed them lots of separate grapes. And I said, what have we got here? It's the grapes, right, plural. What have we got here? Singular grapes, single. And then we unplucked the grapes from the vines. And I said, do we still have a bunch of grapes? And the penny dropped. That wouldn't stay with them for always. That conceptual understanding will waver and hover. It's a very difficult thing, and that's why we have a very long educational process. It's not something that takes a week or a year even. It takes years to be able to move children into the realm of everyday knowledge, the knowledge we use to communicate, to move through the world, to live with our neighbours, to live in our community. All that social knowledge, the cultural beliefs that allow us to do it with ease is the fact that it allows us to do it with ease is the very thing that makes it difficult for us to extract ourselves from it and to move to a more objective plane. And that is where the conceptual academic knowledge is crucial. So when Jacob talked this morning about the need to take responsibility for the world, well, you know, the world is a big place, as you said, Jacob. And, you know, there are monstrosities and there be monsters in the world and there be angels and fantastic things in the world as well. So as teachers, what bit of the world do we have to take responsibility for? And I would argue, and the theme of this conference is knowledge. And it is not just any knowledge. It is academic knowledge. It is formal knowledge. That is the raison d'etre, without which there is nothing. Without which, forget it. And just finally, on the skills thing, just forget skills. Every form of knowledge, from literature to art to playing rugby, PE, has its practical dimension in terms of education. Yeah, when you get to the higher levels, you can think purely abstractly. But when you're learning English literature, when you're learning Shakespeare, you have a process of being able to discover the meanings of that. The child isn't discovering that on its own in the autogenetic way of Rousseau or the child-centered pedagogy, but the meanings are discovered by that child, because that is the difference between education and just, you know, authoritarianism. You will listen to me just on unquestioned authority. You make the reality of knowledge meaningful for the children, and that is a process that is cognitive and it has a practical dimension. You do it through writing. But if you've introduced, and writing's a very difficult discipline, it's very abstract, all the grammar, punctuation, but if you get the children into the world of literature, they will find it easier. They will have their own inner volition to stick with learning the grammar. And that's how you educate them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alka, very much indeed. I wish you were my teacher, Alka. Richard, please. And by the way, do you teach French?
No.
Oh, well.
Thank you very much. My name is Richard, and as Anthony has spoken about, I'm a history teacher originally, and I'm delighted to be here and repeat what János has said, that in Hungary we do not have to reclaim education, do not have to reclaim history education, because we still have it. So please accept it as the framework of my presentation. First of all, I would like to talk about terminology of skills and knowledge. Secondly, some bold international initiatives to identify key competencies. Thirdly, the position of history education in relationship to this. And last but not least, if I have a little time, some words on Hungary. Let's start with Nicholas Tate and his book on conservative case for education. He writes that the academic content of the curriculum should be taught mainly through the disciplines geography, mathematics, history, and biology, as these, in most cases, have an identity, objectives, procedures, and bodies of knowledge that are well established. I completely agree with that, and we usually try to follow this type of frameworks. In connection with terminological questions of knowledge and skills, we usually say that that knowledge has a theoretical root, and concepts are in connection with that. Plus, it is very important that it involves a very deep understanding of the given context. In the case of history, the historical context. On the other hand, skills are creative and practical use of this knowledge. And the third strange and abstract term which is usually competence, is coming from the Latin root competere, to be capable of doing something. It is usually associated with an umbrella term, and it involves values, knowledge, and usually attitudes as well. And people who are said to be education experts really like identifying new trees of competencies, new tracks of competence management. And let me mention some. In 1997, OECD started or established the cooperation DESECO, defining and selecting key competencies, which resulted in some main areas like using tools for interacting effectively. Secondly, interacting in heterogeneous groups. And thirdly, acting autonomously. Doesn't mention knowledge. The 2006 process of European Keystone competence change is resulted in 8 important fields. Let me mention some: social and civic education, entrepreneurship, and cultural awareness. Again, doesn't mention the importance of knowledge. In 2017, DICCOMP EDU, digital competencies education, primarily for educators and teachers, and as a result, for students, doesn't mention knowledge, information and media literacy, communication, responsible use, and problem solving are the main competencies here. OECD Learning Compass, which identified quite boldly the needs of students until 2030, which is quite far away, identified the following key competencies: reconciling tension and dilemmas, creating new value, and empathy, tolerance, evaluating perspectives of others. One last more, which is the PISA global competence. It is again a very abstract one. It identifies examining local, global, and intercultural issues, taking action of collective well-being and sustainable development, engaging in open, appropriate, and effective interactions across cultures. Again, there is no mentioning of sustainable knowledge, disciplinary knowledge, which can be the basis of this. And the question is obvious: without a decent knowledge base, how can we motivate children to think in a complex way, to think in a complex way about historical and philosophical questions as well? And if we move on to the field of history, we all know that education is there for a dialogue with the past. It is extremely important to indicate and to include it into both primary and secondary education. And I suggest 4 very important elements, very important pillars of history education. The first one is, of course, the knowledge, the fundamental disciplinary knowledge, which can contribute to the well-being of whole societies. And skills can only come with a sound understanding of historical context. Secondly, chronology, which is the backbone of the whole learning process, both for history, literature, and philosophy as well. Thirdly, the basis of national identity, which is basically the result of the national narrative of history education. And lastly, the holistic approach. All of these are under attack, basically, in many countries and many cases. Skills are prioritized. We have heard in many cases this EU Parliament report in December in connection with historical consciousness, which primary aim was to focus on European multi-perspectivity and the negligence of the national narrative. Secondly, the thematic approach instead of chronology, study chronology. And the third one is Europeanness and otherness instead of the national narrative. On the other hand, in the Hungarian curriculum, we still, as I have mentioned, we still have the classical approach to education. We still have at least 2 very important pillars of classical education: history and literature education. Philosophy is also present, and religious education, but they are not as strong. Their position is not as strong as the previous 2. History and literature gives the backbone of the Hungarian compulsory subjects. It is compulsory to have history and literature education, both in primary and secondary schools. And it is also compulsory to take an Matura or Abitur type exam at the end of the secondary school. So basically, there is a very thorough knowledge which can be built on. And Jonathan mentioned the Orwellian terms. It is extremely important for the students to understand that war is not peace, that freedom is not slavery, and ignorance is not strength. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Okay, and now Ruth, please, for the final formal presentation.
Hello, and thank you for the organisers for inviting me to speak. I am Ruth, I'm a lecturer in education, but I'm also a school governor at a secondary school in England, and I've got a bit of a background of working in further education in Switzerland as well. I'll finish by saying forget about skills. I think that's wrong. What we need to do is to find the right place for the skills. Yeah? So I would like to address within the discussion what schools should teach the question of vocational skills. Because they are popular, we've heard it, and they are expanding in education. We might call it a creeping vocationalism in education. I think the term describes quite well what is happening. Now, I'm talking about vocational skills. And if you look at the true sense of vocational skills, we're talking about job-specific training, which are related to an occupation at the end of it. Now, schools are not qualified or trained to teach vocational skills in a job-specific sense. So what they do, of course, if they do say they teach skills, they teach what we call transferable skills, the kind of skills probably Alka was referring to before. So we're talking about communication skills, adaptability, problem solving, thinking skills. So the kind of skills, once a person has developed them, supposedly they can apply them or use them from when they move between job roles or different occupations. Now, once this skill agenda takes over or dominates education, we have seen plenty of examples and heard earlier on about the case of Scotland as well, where standards in education are falling. And Scotland, the curriculum for excellence, is a case in point. They have changed, when they introduced the curriculum for excellence in 2009, from they have focused on skills and well-being. That's the particular focus there. And the statistics have shown that since then, the standards in education have lowered. You have the PISA results, which came out just before Christmas, clear decline in reading, maths, and English in Scotland. You have the Scottish Literacy and Numeracy Survey, which is done every year, I believe, and you can see a clear decline in standards in primary schools and lower secondary schools since 2011. So my first point really I want to make is that schools should stay away from vocational skills because they are not trained to do it. If they do it, they will adopt transferable skills and it lowers educational standards. Now the second point I want to make is the people who can and should teach vocational skills are employers. But there's a problem here. Because if we bring skills, or vocational skills, transferable skills, into education and we'll have the effect of lower educational standards, employers suffer that effect. They become remedial educators. Yeah? Because, and that's from a report I've been involved with in 2015, the BERA report. We interviewed and surveyed over 200 employers across different sectors in England. They showed, these young employees or new apprentices, they join the company and they can't read and they can't do maths. So hence, the employers becoming remedial educators because they have to make up for what the children have lost out in the schooling system. Pearson report I was involved in 2016 on world-class apprenticeship standards. What really comes out, if you're looking at high-quality professional skills, you're looking at gold standard apprenticeships, 3 to 4 year training in the company by a master, i.e. somebody who has trained in that profession, has worked in that profession, and has been trained to train the new apprentices in that. So a rigorous vocational apprenticeship scheme. So 2 points really I wanted to make to sum up is schools, yes, schools should stay away from skill teaching because it lowers educational standards. But what we need to do and address is, at the same time, I think, is the vocational skill question. So schools stay away from skills, leave the vocational skill training, the job-specific vocational skill training that leads to a qualification at the end to the employers.
Okay, right. Thanks very much to all of our panel. I've got one question that I want to ask you all to have a stab at, and then I'm going to come out to the audience because I think they'll have lots of questions for you too. So this question's a little bit complicated, so I'll take it slowly. I was really struck by, Alka, your motivation for all students having a moral equality, if I understood you correctly, that all students should be treated as morally equal in terms of their capability or their potential to benefit from the best that has been thought and known. Yeah? Luke, going back to what Anthony was saying at the start. So I think that was really inspiring, what you said. I guess, therefore, my question is, taking on board the points that Ruth just made and the point that Frank made at the very beginning of today between the distinction between training and education. So if I understand correctly, education is much more about what you're talking about, the inspiring vision, and training is something different. How have we ended up here? And because Anthony points back to 300 years ago in Bacon and a utilitarian approach to education 300 years ago. And that therefore there's an aspect about where the sort of economic drive does push some of this agenda. It's not all completely brand new. How have we ended up here? And if you were to, if you like, persuade a parent about the value of the sort of education, Alka, you're talking about, and they're asking you that, yeah, but how's Johnny going to earn his way in life? What would your method of persuasion be? Alka, I'll take you first.
Okay. I have had that parent, yes. I think, well, I'm not going to go into a long history, because I think if you're looking at kind of an intellectual history of ideas, you could go back to various different points. The point I would make about the contemporary situation is what I said at the beginning, is to really reinforce that the discourse, public discourse on education is incredibly fetishized. So it is not the case, I think, Ruth, at a discursive level, a political and a policy level, that the introduction of skills into schools leads to lower educational standards. The introduction of skills in schools is an expression of the prior rejection of educational standards for everybody. It is the justification for moving away from the centrality of knowledge for everybody into a commodification of knowledge where it's parceled up, reframed, recontextualized according to a range of different external criteria, which could be political, economic, and what have you. On the vocational skills, I mean, I would call it as a vocational education, right? I think if I remember some of the history that I have read correctly, I think countries like France and Germany have had quite a strong vocational educational tradition, where students have learned. If you think of a vocation like plumbing, for example, you will learn the disciplinary knowledge that is involved in plumbing, which will be physics. You will also learn a kind of subset of a different form of knowledge, professional knowledge. And that the professional knowledge will be about the regulatory systems, the work system, employment things in which you're working in. And then you also have a third strand, which is the practice. Remember I said every form of knowledge has a practice. And the practice of the physics that have been organised around the aim of creating a plumber will then also be, will then have its practice in the mechanical, the actual physical manifestation of it. And that will give you a different sort of plumber to a plumber who's just been skills educated. The plumber who's just learnt skills will be able to fix perhaps a range of particular problems that he's come across. But if he then comes across an unexpected problem, he will be far less familiar with the knowledge from which he can then, generalize out and try a range of options, and work it out. So you actually extend your repertoire of practical options, the stronger your knowledge content is, which is why I think particularly in the conditions of today, we need to make this argument very strongly.
Okay, thanks. Ruth, I'm going to give you a chance to respond before I go to Anthony and Richard.
If I understood your question right, it is about how much or where's the balance between skills and knowledge in schools, or is it for everybody? That's kind of what you is in there as well. I think yes, knowledge is for everybody. We shouldn't divide between skills and the academically minded students who get more an academic content. I think it's really important that everybody does it. And I just wanted to bring in the example from a school where I mentioned it before. I'm a school governor there, St. Martin's in England, in Leicestershire. It's a small school, 600, 700 pupils. And the intake is from a very deprived area, Hinckley. But they believe in knowledge-based education. They teach a knowledge-based curriculum at the school, so the best that has been thought and said. They read whole texts, not just extracts from there. And, they build on the virtues. They start off with boot camps on virtues, the Socratic virtues, self-control, wisdom, justice, courage. And they believe that everybody, they bring in the knowledge-based education into the schools, and the vocational education, training, apprenticeships comes from that afterwards post-16, post-17. And just to give you an example how they teach courage, because one of the difficult things is, of course, how do you teach courage? You start off with a boot camp, a week, a day, an afternoon, but doesn't mean the guys are going to be, courageous. But what the head teacher's his approach is to say to the pupils, today, just going to be 5% more courageous. Put your hands up if you want to say something. Try that. Or help somebody out where you normally wouldn't stand up for them. So it's a small approach, step by step, and I think it is for everybody, knowledge-based education.
Okay, thanks very much. So, Anthony, without going back to Bacon, you very clearly support knowledge-based education. I've asked the question, how did we get here at the beginning? Being slightly unfair, but perhaps not, you were an advisor to the British government in the mid-90s. What went wrong?
Oh, the government changed.
Okay, but a genuine question.
No, let me...
If we talked about the politicisation of
yes,
education,
yes,
do you think that by the time we got to the point of the mid-90s, before the change of government, things were in quite a poor state then, probably. So, where basically in the mid-90s, when you were advising the government, what was your assessment of the situation, and why had they brought in the national curriculum?
All this history is too boring, and I don't really want to talk about it, because I don't actually think that, as I inferred at the end of what I was saying, I don't think that education should be in the hands of the state. And I think that all the deformations, or not all, but a lot of the deformations which come about are precisely because it's in the hands of governments. Not necessarily, doesn't matter which government. All governments are pretty useless at it. And this is partly because they have economic imperatives. So you can perfectly well see why politicians will say what we need is a very good economy, and what we need for a good economy is plenty of skills, and schools are wasting too much time. And this is why I went back to Bacon. I don't scoff at Bacon. They're spending too much time, this is exactly what he said, Bacon said, teaching Latin and Greek. And what they need to do is the new science, about which, by the way, Bacon knew absolutely nothing, because Bacon didn't understand the mathematical basis of science. But so that's one. So the big, because the government is putting money, of course, they're putting our money into it, but it's putting money into education. They think they've got to produce results, quantifiable results. Then there's the other tendency of governments to say, that we have political agenda towards producing greater equality or social cohesion, or these things, nebulous things, unproducible things, in fact. But this is the rhetoric, and so they will try to. Yes, equality is unproducible. So they will try to rejig the educational structures that they're in charge of to produce these results. And that's exactly what you get. Maybe Hungary and Poland are so far immune, but as we were hearing earlier, they can't just be completely confident of that. As far as skills go, I should have said, I'm not against schools teaching skills. But what I want them to do is to focus on liberal education. Indeed, I want them to I want my plumber. I don't want my plumber to know about quantum theory. I want my plumber to be able to fix my pipe. And you don't have to know about quantum theory to fix my pipe. So I think that one should be realistic about skills. And probably plumbing shouldn't be taught in schools, probably in apprenticeships. But I'm not against skills and other things being taught in school. What I want is, though, the centre of education to be this liberal education. Then you say, well, you said your main question is, how do I convince somebody, a parent who doesn't see the value of this? Well, very likely I won't be able to convince them. But I might be able to by appealing to the sort of considerations that, for example, Hannah Arendt gave, that we are the inheritors of a rich civilization, that has produced scientific knowledge, works of literature and music and so on, and that it's a good thing both for the individuals and for the society as a whole that these things should be acknowledged and respected and understood. There is no other well, there might be side benefits, but these are things that are worthwhile in and for themselves. And I think if you appeal to what most people would think, is it a good thing to know about history? Is it a good thing to understand or to enjoy Shakespeare? Actually, I think if you talk to people in the right way, you might well be able to convince them that it is. But it's not guaranteed. But this is how you would have to go. And if you were setting up a school, if I was setting up a school, I would say, this is what my school is going to do. You, parent, might not want your child to go to my school. Well, fine. But I think I can find enough parents who do.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony. Okay, so getting out to the audience in just a moment. Richard, what's your take on any of this?
Yes, thank you very much. I will be short. You have asked us to give advice for parents. And luckily, I'm also a parent, but only for a 1-year-old beautiful daughter, and there is still time for her to decide, or for us to decide. But she will have a degree, hopefully, at the 2040. So it is extremely hard for us to decide in connection with that. But classical education is a good example and a good way in connection with that. It served humanity for 2,500 years, and I would be happy if she was equipped with a set of skills and knowledge which have a balance between each other and which can complement each other as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, so if you could put your hands up nice and high, we've got this lady here, and then we'll come across the front. And do you want to take the microphone over to that young man in the middle there with the glasses?
Hello, my name is Nina Wolf again. Since this discussion is based upon the teaching of Hannah Arendt's educational philosophy, and since my father arrived on the same ship to New York City after they escaped the Nazis as Hannah Arendt, I'm curious about the teaching of history in our volatile times, which are mimicking the start of World War II. And since she was a surviving refugee, and what I do is talk about Holocaust education in relation to counterterrorism and history, and the Holocaust, apropos my family and others, I was wondering how in these volatile, violent times we can incorporate it, because that's one thing that's not being addressed here, and I'm just curious, how would you do that?
Thanks very much. Yeah, that young man there, and then Richard, if you could give it. Sorry. Great, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Shimon Imrod. I'm a student in Pennsylvania. In general, I think there are two big problems. One of them is that students aren't allowed to make mistakes. And I think that's a big problem, because if you make a mistake, you're punished. The second thing, I think that students aren't allowed enough to work in teams. I think that after you get a degree, in general, you work in teams. You have to solve problems in teams. And the system does not teach you to work in teams. At a test or anything like that, you have a problem, you have to solve it there at that moment. And I'm really curious, what's your opinion on that? Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Two great questions. And anybody on this side? No? Okay, so this gentleman at the front.
Yeah, regarding skills and knowledge, what should the curriculum teach? I had a question to Miss Ruth Mischbuchler. Is it right, the name? The teachers and the skills of the teachers are also really important. Have you ever heard about this science experiment in which they gave the children false results? It was a science experience when they said to the teacher at the end of an IQ test, they said to the teacher, these pupils who don't have the best results have the best results in the IQ tests. And it was not wrong. It was wrong in reality. And at the end of the year, these students, it's called the Pygmalion effect. These students were the best pupils of the class. And so a lot has to do also with the expectations of the teachers towards certain pupils. And I wanted to ask also, in the curriculum, will you also talk about the skills of teachers? Because we always talk about the pupils, and it's always the fault of the pupils, but I think a lot of times it's also the fault of the teachers.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Rob at the front here wanted to speak. We will get everybody else in.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to go back to the remark on the plumber. We don't only want the plumber to fix something, but we also want an honest plumber. And I was thinking a bit further, also with the remark of the lady over there, is Viktor Frankl, for instance, survivor of the camps. One of his big ideas is what people survived the camps, and what profile of people survive very tough situations. That were people with ideas, people with a vision of the future. People who are not educated are not survivors of camps, even when they're physically much better in shape. So I think this is I want to open a bit the discussion about skills and knowledge with this.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, take the Spencer behind you, got Frank and then Cottle in. I'll take two more, bring the panel back and then go back out again.
Right, so I just want to answer the Transylvanian colleague here. It's interesting what you said, because I think the opposite, entirely the opposite to you, which is all right. See, the way that I look at it is mistakes are really important, because every time you burn your finger, you know not to put it in the fire again. And we learn from our mistakes, and that if you don't have any mistakes, it means you never experienced anything. So we all know that. However, I'm a big believer in punishing mistakes. Not because I'm a sadist, I like to be bad to people, but because it is only when you in a classroom make a mistake and you fail or you get a bad mark that you remember your mistake. So punishment has this effect of imprinting in your memory the negative consequences of a mistake. And I think that's a very creative learning experience. Because if you don't get punished for it, you end up in a situation which is very common in Western schools, where you don't get punished for your mistakes, but instead what you are told, and this is very common, that there is no such thing as right and wrong. Right? And a lot of my students in the university in England, when they come to the university and I tell them that's wrong, they say, but professor, in high school we learned there's no such thing as right and wrong, and they kind of continually go on and make that mistake. Now, on the question of group work, I hate group work. I have to say that. And the reason why I hate group work is it's used in schools as a way of avoiding young people being confronted with their own existential sort of problems. Very often when you have a group, you can bypass taking responsibility for what you're learning, because in the end it's the group that decides rather than just you. And therefore in educational institutions where they use group work, you invariably end up in a situation where there is no clear relationship between what you've done and its consequences. And that, I think, is a big problem. Now, later on, when you've become fairly independent intellectually, when you've experienced knowledge and assimilated it, there is a very good case later on for group work. But that happens, I think, I think the best time to do it is not in the first 4 years of university, but after that. Because when you have people who are intellectually independent and self-sufficient, and when they sit together, they can creatively use that group to solve problems, to throw up new problems and everything else. So I would say that that's the only time a group work is good, other than when you go home from school and you sit down with your friend, you have a Coke or drink some coffee, 5 of you sit down from the same class, then it's really good for you to discuss what you've learned together and throw out ideas. But that's you informally deciding that it's an important discussions to be had. And I say this because in England, a lot of good educational opportunities were destroyed by group work because it is used by bad teachers not to have to teach. And that's ultimately what it is. You know, I'm not going to teach you. You're going to learn from each other. And unfortunately, that's a recipe for disaster.
Okay, thanks very much. So pass it back, please, to Hein. Then we'll take the panel back, so panel will be ready, and then we'll go out and get everybody else.
So, Katalin Demme, MCC Brussels. We were speaking about different aspects with respect to education and knowledge and skills, but we weren't mentioning one important phenomenon, and this is the joy. Because we all agree upon the joy is the most motivating factor with respect to education. Now, I have an interesting background because I was living in Denmark for the last 20 years, and the Danish school system and the Scandinavian school system is very skill-based, skill-focused, creativity-focused. And there is a kind of general opinion that, well, skill-based education produces happy children, that children, they are very, very happy to go to school. And this is a question to all of you, how would you counter argument as a proponent of classical education? How would you explain that joy is an important factor also in knowledge-based education? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so I'm going to bring the panel back in, choose to address the questions that appeal to you, but please, there was this question about skills of teachers, and we haven't said very much about teacher training at all, and where that fits in. So I would be very interested in your opinions on that. But Richard, starting with you.
Okay, general skills of teacher training. I wanted to comment on the question of the Holocaust as well, without going into details or giving you a recipe in connection with how to teach horrors of history or other aspects as the sins of the communism. I believe that the worst thing which we can do is to ignore history, and it is also in connection with this exclusively European idea behind history education. We cannot ignore the past, and we should analyze. We should research what has happened, and for example, this topic starts with the Versailles Treaty, and without existential and fundamental knowledge of history, they wouldn't be able to understand the question which came later as well. About general skills, I think it is extremely important for the teacher candidates in all Europe to be able to communicate with the students, to be able to identify the most significant problems, and to use the objectives Frank has said, because group work cannot work without individual work, and it is basically the dissemination of individual roles as the leader, as somebody who takes the time, as somebody who takes notes, and the collaboration can only come after everybody does his or her work.
Okay, thanks very much. Anthony, would you like to go next?
Yes. Group work was, of course, what Dewey advocated, and he saw it as part of this democratic classroom in which, as I just said, the teacher was just the facilitator. I'm sure you all know plenty of democratic classrooms. And I think that, although I wouldn't be dogmatic about excluding all group work, I think that Dewey's idea shows that there is a kind of fallacy at the bottom of this, or at least of the way he saw it anyway, that actually the teacher isn't the authority. So the teacher is the person who knows, or hope. Of course, unfortunately, they might not, but that is what should be the situation, and the pupils are the ones that learn. And of course, they can talk about it among themselves, but the teacher's authority must not be eroded by group work. And again, I would say that we can look, I don't know whether Hannah Arendt actually talked about this, but Hannah Arendt does stress that children are not adults, and children must be treated differently, and they must not be made to take responsibility for things that they're not able to take responsibility for. And she calls that natality. And I think that's actually a very strong theme in her that I'd like to pursue. As far as history goes, it seems to me to be essential for people, individuals, and for the society to have people who understand something about the history, or a lot, preferably, about the history of the past, first of their country and then of other parts of the world. Now, of course, everybody will say, oh, well, history is all biased. You know, you've got this type of history and that type of history, and we get revisions. That is true, and that is an aspect of humane development, humane learning, that many of these things are contested. And in seeing how they are contested, that's how they develop, that's how we learn more. Maybe that's an element, well, it obviously is an element of human fallibility. And I think that what we should aim for in subject like history, well, actually all subjects probably, literature, study of literature and so on, is what Leavis called a collaborative, communicative dialogue. So it's contested, but you work out the contests by taking opposing views and considering them respectfully and seriously. And this, unfortunately, is too much what doesn't happen now. I'm surprised that the Holocaust isn't taught. I'm surprised to hear that it isn't taught. Actually, if I may refer to the English national curriculum, at one time it was the only compulsory topic in the English national curriculum. Joy. Yes, the end might be joy, or might not be, but the means isn't necessarily joy. And I'll just tell you a little story about the greatest teacher of ballet in the history of the world, Enrico Cecchetti, who taught all the great Russian dancers before the First World War, and then went and taught in the West as well. Karsavina said, the greatest ballerina ever, said that she was only pleased when Cecchetti was angry with her. It was the ones, he just said, very nice, darling. They were the ones who were no good. So there was this kind of tension that goes with good teaching, where the child is pressed, prodded, not necessarily in a cruel way, though I think possibly that wouldn't entirely have been true with Cecchetti, but they must be put on their mettle. And it isn't all joy, even if the end is joy.
Thank you very much. Great story. Yeah. Ruth, your chance.
Yeah, two brief response really. One about the Holocaust education. On the Holocaust Memorial Day at the University of Derby, we invited Dr. Martin Stern to come and give a talk, to talk about his experience. He was 5 years old at the time. He lived in the Netherlands and ended up in Auschwitz. And he talked for an hour and a half. It was an incredibly moving story. He managed to deliver it with a hint of, with a bit of fun. Don't ask me how he did it. Incredibly moving. But what he also does, besides coming to universities, is going to schools. So he talks about the stories. But the really disheartening thing that happened to him is when, at the end of an hour's talk with the children about his experience, the teacher says, "So, what have you all learned? Don't bully." And that's degrading. It's degrading the whole experience, which came over as so powerful just through the story. And it just brings us back to knowledge. If you study the Holocaust, don't compare it to other terrorist attacks. Stick with it. It's an important topic, and treat it, give it the respect it deserves. Just one more quick story. Teacher training about it. First, what the teachers need is knowledge. They need subject knowledge. Before we even start to talk about skills, I think they need the subject knowledge. I wouldn't dislike the idea of do teacher training as in apprenticeships, because you learn from an experienced teacher. And once you have the subject knowledge, you then learn how to do it in an effective way. And it's a process. You're not necessarily very skillful at the time. And to bring back, how do we, create that enthusiasm for classical education. I teach, as part of my course, we have Erasmus students. We get teacher training, primary school teacher training students from Holland. They study with us at university for 6 months. Now, one of the sessions I teach is about classical education. And this particular student from Holland, she's doing teacher training. She never heard about the classical education, classical approach to teaching. It was the first time she was exposed to it. She loved it. She was fired up about it. She did her assignment on it because she wanted to know more about it. And she went back to Holland, you know, to continue with that. So I think we just need to talk more about it and persuade the individual.
Okay, thanks very much, Ruth. Alka, your brief thoughts, please.
I agree on the experiential knowledge. Again, I just go back to my first point. Can we just stop talking about skills in education? And that includes in teacher education. You need disciplinary knowledge and you need experiential knowledge, which, you know, the whole point about experiential knowledge, you can't condense it in a moment. And that's one of the tragedies of the profession, is that a lot of the older teachers are the first to leave. And so the idea of apprenticeship, however it's organised through, I think the traditional B.Ed seemed to me fairly good, a 4-year course with the foundational subjects, and then in the final year it was ever increasing amounts of experienced teaching, but under the mentorship and supervision of an experienced teacher. That seems to me an eminently sensible thing to do. The only skill I ever learnt as a teacher was how to hand out photocopies. This was at the Institute of Education in the early 90s, and apparently you meant to do them, you know, once start here and start there, and then anyway, at least an hour was spent on that. So forgive me if I hate skills in teacher education. I agree with Ruth on vocational education happening after schools, separate from schools. The Holocaust thing, I think, is really a very tricky and difficult. It's a tricky thing. We have to be clear in our minds what it is we want to do. What is it we're doing? If we're teaching it as history, which I think, Anthony, you're right, it is still it's about the only mandatory thing in the British curriculum, but history itself is only mandatory up to the age of 14. And even up to the age of 14, it's modular, so, you know, there's a lot of variation there, but I think the Holocaust is a mandatory subject. So there's teaching it as history, just as there is teaching slavery as history, or the Bengal famine, or colonialism, or, you know, some indigenous massacre, wherever, you know, all these controversial things at the moment. But then there's also, are we asking schools to teach it as a moral precept in some way, which I think you enter a different discussion. We need to think about different things. Just quickly on values. Sorry, Ruth, I just don't think you can teach values. Let me just put it this way. Like you said, you know, the teacher saying, oh, you know, be a good friend, help somebody when you see them. Well, I've said that to another teacher, and they've said, oh, yes, of course. You know, we've got to be good allies. You know, we must have allyship. We must teach allyship. Right? That is not what we mean. You know, that is not what we mean. I think in schools it is really important we exemplify values in everything we do. In the way we enter the classroom, enter the school, the way we dress. This doesn't mean everyone has to dress like me, by the way. It just means you take a pride in you know, you mark the distinction between the outside world and school.
Yeah, thanks very much. Right. Okay, Richard, if you could grab this microphone again. We'll get as many of you in as possible. We've got a young man, or youngish man, there in the white top. Jacob, I think you wanted to come in. And I can see Joanna as well. Oh, and Penny over there. Go ahead.
Thank you. My question is to Ruth. Don't you think that giving a monopoly to employers to teach professions will lead to unfavorable contracts and an unhealthy dynamic?
Okay, thanks very much. Jacob?
Yeah, it's just to raise a question, because I'm not entirely sure I can go fully along with Alka's kind of thorough attempt to separate off skills from the world of education. I know why we don't like what passes for skills today. We don't like transferable skills. We don't like business skills. We don't like all those things that kind of degrade and undermine the curriculum. But at the same time, it is very important that when you learn various academic subjects, you do get some things that I think we can only call skills, such as the ability to do research, the skill in sifting through information and deciding what's kind of worth your time and what's not worth your time. And there's a whole other load of them that come along with that. But isn't the point that those kind of things, which happen to be, as it were, some of the things that employers actually do like to look for in people coming into the workplace, isn't the point that they can only be acquired through discipline, through studying something carefully, becoming interested in a particular topic in English or in history or whatever, and through the process of getting interested in your subject, you do acquire some skills. So I think we can be a little bit more sanguine about the fact that there are such things as skills. Education does transmit them, but we just have to be very clear in saying that those are not the kind of things that are the transferable skills that exist in abstract or in opposition to content and proper knowledge.
Is it me? Yeah. This is a question for Anthony. I wondered what you thought about Paulo Freire, because you talk a lot about Marx as being the root of this problem, whereas I kind of feel like the root is much more contemporary. And as Hannah Arendt said, while she criticised Marx, she was always very suspicious of people that made too much of criticising Marx. So I'm trying to think about this idea of how we defend knowledge, not just knowledge as the basis of education, but how we defend knowledge as something that is constantly evolving. And I think one of the reasons that young people don't understand what we're saying quite often is that they've been educated in the tradition of believing that knowledge and ideology are the same thing, which doesn't come from Marx. It comes much more contemporary idea, that basically learning is a very private individual thing, and when teachers tell you how to understand the world, they're somehow undermining your sense of agency. So it's for anybody, but Anthony in particular, do you recognise that that's part of the problem?
Okay. Lots of the classical and liberal education still exists. It's not all gone. And the state has introduced many reforms that diminished the tradition of liberal and classical education, but at the same time, it is with its curriculum part of the guarantee that part of that liberal and classical education still exists. So if you say all that the government does is negative, what's the alternative? I know the alternative of Anthony O'Hare. Okay, I start my new school and I will do it along these lines. And if you look for another school, well, go to another school, which is okay for me. But I don't know if that is a good guarantee for liberal and classical education in the whole of society. Okay.
Thank you. I completely agree that knowledge is foundational to classical education, but I do think it's worth understanding a little bit about the history of skills in education to understand how we've moved so far from a classical concept of education. So just, I promise very, very briefly, but if we go back to the 1980s, certainly in the UK, then employability skills existed as very discrete units within the school curriculum. So you actually could have lessons in typing, for example, for girls to go and become secretaries, woodwork, metalwork. The kind of the beauty of this, if you like, was that academic subjects could exist unmolested, for want of a better word. But the problem was that by the time we'd reached 1990s, employability skills had shifted to skills for employability, which is a kind of rhetorical sleight of hand, but actually implies something quite different, because when you're dealing with skills for employability, you can then introduce this into all other aspects of the curriculum. To give another example of this, in 2001, the Labour Party produced a document called Skills for Life, and Skills for Life was very much involved with basic English, numeracy, functional skills. But 10 years on, Skills for Life had changed to life skills, which was again about your kind of your group work, your interaction, even personal hygiene, sexuality education, and it was about teaching people kind of how to live. And again, this is managed to infiltrate all subject areas across the curriculum. And I think this is important because I think we see how really this is about the degradation of academic knowledge through the metaphor of skill.
Okay, thanks ever so much. So we'll do this in reverse order, so the opposite order to which you started. So Ruth, you get to go first.
Yeah, I'll address the apprenticeship question, and will it lead to, if we leave it to employers, will it lead to unfavorable contracts? We've got some very, very good examples of, you might refer to them as gold standard apprenticeships, Germany, Denmark, Austria. In Austria, since the 1960s, they haven't really changed the laws or the policies around apprenticeships, not in a major way. They know what they want and they're with it. And the employers have been able to build on that. They developed a really, really good system. Now, in comparison to that, in England, we have lots of changes in law. We had the apprenticeship system, modern apprenticeships, then we went back to apprenticeships, we went from framework to standards, and there is just no time for the employers to in any way keep up with all that. So what we have in England, where we have not so much the employers in control, at least in some sectors, but the state, you have very low standard, what I would say low standard apprenticeships, because they're a year long. And you can't teach an electrician to become a good electrician in a year. You need more than that, a plumber even not. So year-long apprenticeships are not good. We have existing skills in England are being accredited. So people who are actually in employment just get the certificate, or very, very low skills. So and the only the only good apprenticeships you see emerging within that system in England is individual companies, Rolls-Royce, BAE System in engineering, Bombardier, setting up their own training programs, and they're really successful, and they're 3 to 4 years long. So no, I don't think so.
Thank you, Ruth. Richard.
Thank you very much. I also wanted to comment on apprenticeship in connection with history and generally teacher education. In Hungary, we stopped the Bologna system and returned to the one-cycle teacher training, which lasts for 5 years in one go. And there is no BA, MA differentiation. The students enter the schools at the first year as well, and they visit. There are organized visits, and we call it hospitable, and basically they are getting more and more involved in the education process. They have the knowledge at the university. They are students at the university, but they are getting used to their new role. And the last whole year, 2 semesters, are dedicated to teaching practice, which is some kind of apprenticeship, because they have a mentor, tutor, and they are also supported by university lecturers. So this is the complex way of teaching.
Great, thank you, Richard. Alka.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to remain very authoritarian and be hardline on my distinction of skills. Jacob, having praised you for your wonderful introduction, I have now got to be school marmy and say, what on earth are you thinking of, if I heard you correctly? Deciding what's worthwhile. Is that a skill? Surely not. Surely that just is the antithesis of everything we've been talking about. it's laden with value judgments there that are not skills. Joanne, I really thank you for your potted history of it speaks to the point I made at the beginning, that the introduction of skills in education discourse today is a fetishization, and it speaks to the loss of our understanding of knowledge. As to whether typing is a skill or not, in that probably people would learn it as part of a secretarial course where it would be combined with other things. My son did like 2 weeks of typing and it was introduced. It's a repetitive form of physical action. There is not even in those things, there is knowledge behind what created the typewriter that creates the office. Basically, if we're human, there's very little we can do that doesn't have some kind of knowledge, even though we might do it with more or less consciousness of it. It can be tacit and explicit. And education is about learning how to move between all those different levels and knowing what are the right criteria to apply in those levels. That's entirely an intellectual and imaginative and moral thing.
Okay, thank you very much, Elke. Jake will no doubt enjoy a conversation with you over lunch, as would I. Anthony.
Yes, I think that Paulo Freire, I did read him some time ago, I think he wanted education to be an agent of the revolution. And of course, he had his influence, and maybe still does. Why I said Marx was because I think all these people are, in a sense, children of Marx in the following sense, that Marx was one of the three great and fallacious unmaskers of recent times. The other was Darwin, and the other was Freud. Freud said everything was to do with sex. Darwin said everything was to do with survival and reproduction. Marx said everything was to do with economics and ideology. And as far as I know, Marx was an economic determinist. No doubt people who know more about Marx will correct me and tell me, oh no, he wasn't. Well, actually, I think he was. And he also, I think, believed that there was something called the infrastructure and something called the superstructure. And the superstructure, which included ideas, was what was determined by the infrastructure. Of course, this is all terribly crude, and no doubt Marx qualified it in lots of ways. But I think that's certainly the general drift of his thought. And this is why all knowledge, in kind of Marxist terms, reduces to ideology, because none of it is, as it were, impartial or autonomous. It's all determined by this fundamental economic reality that Marx thinks is driving everything. And of course, it's precisely that the liberal educator is going to oppose, and they're going to say that it's not. Of course, there are economic influences on, the way we think. No doubt, you could say that Homer wouldn't have written, didn't write actually. Homer wouldn't have composed in the way he did if he hadn't lived in an archaic society, with its own structure and so on and so forth. But the point is, the great writers transcend, and the great artists. Vermeer, yes, Dutch bourgeoisie, but he takes us to heaven. The great people transcend their origins, and that's why they're interesting. And that's how I would reply to the people who say that everything that is operative in our society is all to do with oppression.
Okay. Anthony, thank you very much. Perhaps a big round of applause for our speakers, please. Okay, lots to debate and discuss. We have lunch over which you can continue the conversation, and then after lunch we have therapeutic education, followed by the politicisation of education. Okay, thank you.